This talk is about how to model um, heterogeneous set of random variables. Um, so it's essentially about graphical models over a heterogeneous set of random variables. So what is a graphical model? It's essentially a joint distribution over a lot and lot of random variables. And it's a graphical model because you represent essentially a family of distributions using a graph. You have a graph node for each random variable, and you have edges indicating not causal relationships, not correlation, but conditional independence. So, a node, given its neighbors in the graph, would be conditionally independent of its non-neighbors. Given a separating set and variables corresponding to the separating set, conditioned on those, the separated components, the variables in the separated components, are conditionally independent. So these are all conditional independence assumptions, and the set of all distributions that satisfy these assumptions form that family of graphical model distributions represented by that graph. Now, this is all beautiful mathematically, probabilistically, and so on and so forth, but they are useful because of this beautiful theorem by Hammersley-Clifford, which says that any positive, strictly positive graphical model distribution factors according to the graph. But that is meant that the joint distribution, again, which is a p-variate function if I have p random variables, is a product of local functions. Functions, each of which depends only on a subset of the random variables. So this is, again, wonderful because I can represent a huge multivariate function using smaller variate functions. But there's still a model selection issue at play here, which is how do I select these local functions? And what is typically done is that people focus on subclasses of graphical models for specific kinds of data. So let's say I have discrete data. So that happens a lot in computer vision, where each pixel intensity is typically discretized. The values might be 0 to 255, and so on and so forth. And so what's typically used is a Potts model. So this is a specific subclass of graphical model distributions, which has this nice form. It's an exponential family with certain sufficient statistics that are local. So typically use pairwise graphical models where the sufficient statistics, or the functions, local functions, are just over edges. And so in the Potts model, all you care about are whether the nearby pixels have the same value or not. Okay, so that's the indicative function over there. And so even with this very simple sufficient statistics, these are extensively used in computer vision and in other settings as well. And for such discrete data, where each random variable takes finitely many values, I can have other such specific subclasses of graphical models. I have Ising models, which have linear and quadratic sufficient statistics, and the overcomplete discrete graphical model, and all of which are used extensively in recent years across science and engineering. Okay, so you use them in social networks, you use them even in bioinformatics, and so on and so forth. So what if I don't have discrete data? What if I have continuous data? So this happens a lot in biological settings, where, let's say, I'm measuring gene activation levels, and my experiment gives me continuous values for the expression levels of each gene. And I observe multiple genes together, and I want to model the joint expression of all my genes. And so what I need is a graphical model. And here, people use Gaussian graphical models. So here, the sufficient statistics, again, similar to the Ising model, are linear and quadratic. And people use this specific subclass of graphical models. Okay, but what if I don't have continuous data? What if I have count-valued data? So in recent years, in the next generation sequencing technologies, we measure gene expression using count-valued data. So I measure the expression level of any gene via counts. And so now I need a joint distribution over multiple count-valued random variables. And so what I really need is a Poisson graphical model. And so again, I can define a specific subclass which is targeted to this data type. And so on and so forth. People have developed wonderful specific subclasses for specific data types. But what if we are in a so-called big data setting, and we are in a really, we have all kinds of data together? So let's even look at the biological setting, the bioinformatics setting. So I have a whole bunch of genomic data for each gene, whether it has mutated for one particular individual or not, so that would be binary. Or I might see SNP data, which would be ternary, or I might see continuous gene expression or count value gene expression, and so on and so forth. So I have all this genomic and transcriptomic data jointly together. And so all of this is heterogeneous in the sense that I have variables, everything that I'm observing together, each of which has its own data type. So can I now, so this is a challenge in bioinformatics, can we learn a joint distribution for all this data together? And preferably using a graphical model so that I have a graph, a conditional independence graph connecting all these random variables. So can I get, in other words, such a mixed graphical model? And so that's the topic of this talk. Okay? And we want a really general toolkit so that I don't want to specify specific subclasses or specific collections of mixed data. So what's been done here, so there is a specific subclass of such mixed graphical models for the case where I have a mixed set of continuous data and discrete data. And so for this, Lauritsen in late 90s formulated the conditional Gaussian Markow random fields, where conditioned on the set of discrete random variables, the set of continuous random variables are Gaussian, conditionally Gaussian. And so there has been some recent work which showed that you can actually learn the association graph amongst all the continuous random variables conditioned on the discrete random variables. And you can even extend this to higher order factors and so on and so forth. But this, again, is a very specialized mixed graphical model for the case where I have continuous and discrete data. Okay, so what if I have count value data? What if I have other kinds of skewed continuous data, for instance, or positive continuous data? How do I model such mixed graphical models? Is there a general theory we can come up with? And so that's the question. How can I come up with such a multivariate mixed Markow random fields? And if I think about the question, if I just have a single random variable, so it could be any type. So let's say I have a heterogeneous set of random variables, data types, and I just want to focus on modeling a univariate distribution. We know how to do that. There's a lot of work in statistics on, given a particular random variable and of any type, we have various distributions. There are whole booklets of univariate distributions, both for continuous and discrete data and so on, and I know how to do that. The difficulty comes when I want to extend the univariate story to the multivariate story, where I also want to capture the dependencies between all the random variables. How do I do that? That's what we want to do. So how do I go from a knowledge of univariate distributions, just turn a crank, and come up with a multivariate distribution? And that's what we want to do. And so before getting into that crank, let me talk a little bit about univariate distributions. So when I said that faced with a particular data type, I can come up with a nice univariate distribution. A wonderful family of univariate distributions is an exponential family of distributions. So that's given by this very simple expression where, so x is a random variable and it's univariate in this case. And so modulo a base measure, a normalizing measure so that the distribution normalizes, the distribution only depends on the random variable via the sufficient a certain set of sufficient statistics, which enter into a linear combination with some parameters inside an exponential. That's it. So it's a very, very simple family of distributions indexed essentially by the sufficient statistics B and the base measure C. So as you vary over base measure C and sufficient statistics B, you get many, any of the many exponential family distributions: Gaussian, Poisson, negative binomial, gamma, and so on and so forth, Bernoull, and so on and so forth, just by varying B and C. Okay? And given B and C, you in turn have a subfamily of distributions indexed by the parameters theta. Okay? And so this would be the family of univariate distributions I'll be dealing with. And what I want is to go from such univariate distributions for various data types to a multivariate graphical model distribution. So how do I do that? And so let's look at what we know about specific subclasses of graphical models. So what about the Gaussian graphical model? So what are some of its properties in terms of univariate distributions? If you focus on the conditional distribution of each variable conditioned on the rest of the variables, that's Gaussian, univariate Gaussian. And similarly, if I talk about an Ising model, where all the variables are binary, if I focus on a conditional distribution of any of the binary random variables conditional on the rest, that's Bernoull. And similarly, if I look at a Poisson graphical model, also called Poisson auto model by Besag, if I look at the Poisson graphical model, the conditional distribution of each count-valued variable conditional on everybody else is univariate Poisson. Okay, so we see these very interesting properties for all the famous subclasses of graphical models. And so we can ask the same question. We can, or we can try to do the same resume of imposing conditional distributions to follow exponential families. Okay, so let's say I have p random variables, x1 through xp, and for each of which could belong to a completely different data type. One could be continuous and so on and so forth. But the conditional distribution of each random variable, say x sub s, conditional on everybody else, I'm going to assume belongs to some exponential family. And these exponential families could be different for each random variable. Okay, so that's all I'm saying. The conditional distributions belong to exponential families. So let's say I make this very broad and general assumption. And remember that since I'm focusing on the conditional distribution, I can try to find the right exponential family for that univariate distribution. So, but under this assumption that the node conditional distributions are exponential families, what I want is a joint distribution where the dependency structures, the conditional independence structure, is captured by a graph. And so I want it essentially to belong to a graphical model family. So can I get both of these properties? Okay, so would such a joint distribution exist? And if it does, what form would that take? Okay, so here is a more formal way of presenting that question. So I have p random variables, and each conditional distribution of one variable conditioned on everybody else, x sub s, conditioned on the rest of the random variables, belongs to an exponential family. So what I mean by that, what I'm saying is that given node S, fix a sufficient statistic and base measure. That's all you need to specify your exponential family. Right? But of course, it's conditioned on the rest of the random variables, so the parameters of the exponential family could depend on the rest of the variables in an arbitrary way. Okay? So when I say that the conditional distributions belong to an exponential family, this is what I mean. Okay? So the parameter could be a function of the rest of the random variables in an arbitrary way. I'm not going to make any further assumption on this function. Okay? And my joint distribution, I want to be a product of local factors, each of which has size at most k. So I'm making these two assumptions. And I'm asking, is there a joint distribution that satisfies these very general assumptions? And we have a theorem that says yes. And what's more, there exists a single distribution that satisfies these assumptions. That the node conditional distributions are exponential families, okay, arbitrary exponential families, and the joint distribution factors, where the factors have size at most k, what it turns out is that the joint distribution necessarily has this form, where the factor of size k is this very easy to, I guess, see form, which is a tensor product. It's just a product of univariate functions. And what are these univariate functions? Precisely the univariate sufficient statistics arising at the node conditional distributions. That's it. Okay, so all the factors are just these products of univariate functions. So the model selection question of how do I pick these local factors in graphical models is just answered by this theorem, where it is a necessary consequence of assuming that my node conditional distributions follow specific exponential families. Okay? And this is very, very general. Right? So to apply this to a given data set where I have p random variables, each with its own data type, all you need to do is for each random variable specify the exponential family that it should belong to. Okay? So in other words, for each random variable s, come up with the sufficient statistics and the base measure. And that's all you need to specify the joint distribution. Okay? So you could work with time interval data, count data, various exotic kinds of data, and you have this wonderful parameterized graphical model distribution. Okay? So even if you do not care about graphical models, and you just want to some multivariate distribution, you can use this. Okay. So So again, this allows us to specify a general graphical model distribution, but in typical application settings, we focus on pairwise graphical models, where the factors are just over edges. So our factors is just size 2, and these factors are just over edges of the graph. And so we call these Manichean graphical models. So Manicheanism was a old Persian religion slash philosophy which hinged on duality. And in general, a Manichean worldview has a dualistic worldview, good and evil, and so on and so forth. And so here, our world consists of p-random variables, which just have 2 types. And if you do have something like that, which is most application settings, you can actually use a subclass of our general mixed graphical model family, where I just have two sets of sufficient statistics and 2 sets of base measures, corresponding to the 2 types. And so that'll just look like this. So even though this is a lot of expressions, what I really have are, think of the factors, think of the sufficient statistics. They are either linear in the individual sufficient statistics, or interaction terms are just of size 2, which is just products of the sufficient statistics. So I might have interaction terms just within the y variables, just within the z variables, or between y and z. And so now I can come up with very interesting classes of mixed graphical models. So I can have the Gaussian Ising model, which was there in, even in the Lauritz and work, but I can come up with new classes of mixed graphical models. I can mix and match anything. I can come up with the Poisson Ising graphical model, again, where the sufficient statistics are all linear and quadratic, and except for this base measure. Right? What about Gaussian and Poisson graphical model? And so here again, linear and quadratic because of the individual sufficient statistics, and with a Gaussian base measure and a Poisson base measure. Okay, so can I use a Gaussian Poisson? Unfortunately not. Or you can still use it. But one thing that I didn't talk too much about was that the theorem only said that the joint distribution takes this form. But one thing that the theorem did not say was what are the restrictions on the parameters theta so that the joint distribution would be normalizable. Right? So even with the multivariate Gaussian distribution, there are certain restrictions on the edge weights, on the parameters, specifying the GMRF so that the joint distribution is normalizable. Right? It should be negative definite and so on. And so here, it turns out that if you do an arbitrary mixing and matching of, say, Gaussian and Poisson, it turns out that the interaction terms between the Gaussian and the Poisson data types has to be 0. Okay, so it's essentially the only way you're going to get a Gaussian-Poisson mixed graphical model is as a product of a Poisson graphical model times a Gaussian distribution. Okay, so that's the only way to get a normalizable distribution. So can we talk about normalizability more generally? And because this seems like, okay, there are certain caveats. And in our paper, we do talk about how to characterize normalizability. In other words, what are the restrictions on theta, or potentially on the sufficient statistics, or on the base measure, and so on and so forth, so that, which in turn specify normalizability restrictions on theta. Okay, so what's the domain of these mixed graphical models? So in the interest of time, let me skip this so that I can talk a little bit about the learning of such mixed graphical models. So here again, let's say I have a Manichean graphical model, variables of 2 types, and this is my joint distribution. So again, I have interaction terms just within the y variables and just within the z variables, and interactions between the y and z variables. And what I really want is to recover all these interaction terms. So remember that each interaction term you can think of as corresponding to an edge in an overall association graph, okay, where each node corresponds to a particular random variable. And so how do we estimate such a mixed graphical model? Following a line of work in recent years, what we do is just node neighborhood estimation. Instead of recovering the entire graph structure, I focus on a local problem, which is for each node, recover just its neighborhood. And if I recover the neighborhood of each and every node, I recover the entire graph. So that's all I need to do. I reduce it to recovering the neighborhoods of each node. And how do I recover the neighborhood of each node? What you do is just solve for the conditional MLE. Just solve for the conditional distribution, and imposing appropriate structural regularization, you can actually recover the set of neighbors of every node. So that's what we do. And we have theorems that say that if so long as you set the regularization penalties appropriately, and so long as certain incoherence conditions hold, just a very simple L1 regularized method actually works in recovering the node neighborhoods of your mixed graphical model. Okay? So essentially, the slide says that a bunch of the recent results on learning graphical models extend to the mixed graphical model setting. And so here are some simulation plots. So here I'm just plotting the ROC plots between the true positive rate and the false positive rate. And so each graph corresponds to a different Manichean graphical model. And the different curves correspond to different different sample sizes. N is a problem size. So these are small models, around 100 nodes. But what you can see is that we are able to recover the graph structure. Okay? So the ROC plot is going towards 1 as you get more and more samples. So I'll use my -1 minutes for this very interesting application, which was really what motivated this whole line of work, which was to look at genomic and transcriptomic data together. So we looked at around 700 breast cancer patients from the Cancer Genome Atlas. And so here in this specific experiment, what we did was, so here we have random variables corresponding to genes. But now, instead of just measuring the expression levels of genes, so here we used RNA-seq so that the expression levels are count-valued. We also had the mutation status of the individual for the various genes. And so that would be a binary random variable. So here, I had a Poisson-Ising mixed graphical model to fit the joint genomic transcriptomic data. Okay, so instead of a vanilla Poisson graphical model, we used something called a truncated Poisson graphical model. We had a paper last year where we came up with various variants of Poisson graphical models that don't have the pathological normalizability conditions on the parameters. And so here, we used a truncated Poisson graphical models and Ising graphical model. And what we found were a lot of interesting aspects. Again, so here the yellow correspond to the gene expression via RNA-seq, and the blue corresponds to the mutation status random variables. And so, I mean, you have, for any gene, you have variables, both yellow and blue corresponding variables. So if you think that a particular gene is mutated, it will affect its own activation level. So that's not that interesting, such an edge. But what's more interesting is that if a gene is mutated, does it affect the expression levels of other genes? And so here we do get such interesting clusters of blue hub nodes connected to yellow transcriptomic nodes. And so some of the clusters, such as using TPF3 gene, which people did know about, but we did also come up with certain other hub nodes, which we are working with oncologists who are quite excited by this. And so this is really a problem that is increasingly of importance in bioinformatics, which is to deal with all this data jointly and try to understand all of them together. And we can do that now with mixed graphical models. So I'll just summarize. What we have done is really come up with an off-the-shelf graphical model toolkit. So if you have different data types, you don't need to do any further effort to come up with a nice parametric class of graphical models, multivariate distributions. And can you learn these from very limited data? The answer is yes to that as well. You can learn them from very limited data using very, very efficient learning methods. And we are coming up with an R package very, very soon. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. Yes?
Yeah, we use your method of pseudo-likelihood to get protein structure predictions from sequence alignments. And one issue is that if you're interested in the biggest effect, it works better with an L2 regularizer than an L1 regularizer. And it's also, if you have then you're learning a Potts model, it depends on how you do the matrix norm of the matrix that you learn for the Potts model. So the score is really important with performance. Could you comment on these issues? for instance, why L1 or L2, which is simple?
Right, yeah. So, to get the right set of neighbors, I guess you need to use L1 plus L2, L1, L2 regularization.
Maybe you're not so interested in
That's
exact
right.
neighborhood reconstruction, but only the biggest effects.
Right. So I guess even for such a weakly sparse, where you have a few dominant edge weights and a few, they kind of decay, even there, you want to use L1 based or something involving sparsity perhaps. It would behave slightly better. Though it does have certain conditions on the edge weights, which are not as satisfactory. But I don't want to suggest that you can only do this using L1 based methods. Perhaps you could use greedy methods, which relax some of these restrictions. So I can recover the neighborhood of each node using any sparsistent estimation method, and then you can just combine all of those. Absolutely. Yeah.
Other questions? Okay, I have a small question. Since you define your distribution through conditionals, can you say anything about the marginals?
Right. So since that's, so if you look at copulas, so there they specify the marginals, and then the dependency is from an entirely different function, multivariate function. So here, all you need to do is specify the conditionals, and then the joint is just automatically follows. Now, what is the marginal? Because the conditionals are, let's say, Gaussian, or conditional is, say, Poisson, the marginal would be a mixture of Poissons. And so that's one, so the marginals won't belong to that exponential family, it belong to a mixture of exponential families.
So that determines the tails.
That,
Because it's a mixture of Gaussians, you have constraints on the tails.
that you could think of it that way. Yeah. But the constraints of the interaction terms really drops out of the normalizability. So I make all these local assumptions, and then I'm saying that there exists a joint, but there exists a joint only provided that the terms allow for a normalizable joint. And so that's the restriction.
Thank you.